Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and partners, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this virtual event of the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, the ACMI. My name is Sarah Rosengartner. I'm a member of the team that coordinates the ACMI, and I lead the consultations with stakeholders. I will guide us through today's agenda. I look forward to welcoming 3 distinguished panels today. While the ink is still drying on the outcome document in Glasgow, they will help us frame the conversation as we kick off the work towards COP27, the African COP. We will be hearing from ACMI principals and partners and a rich group of experts about one of the key issues facing the African continent in the 21st century. Africa is one of the most climate vulnerable continents. It's also a continent on the move. Regrettably, more frequent and severe disasters and environmental degradation are increasing the vulnerability of communities across Africa. Some are forced to leave their homes. Others may see their ability to move weakened. An active and informed approach to climate mobility is central to furthering the continent's capacity to adapt and build resilience in the context of the climate crisis. The Africa Climate Mobility Initiative is a joint effort of the African Union Commission, the United Nations Development Programme, the International Organization for Migration, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the World Bank. It aims to generate political momentum, a joint policy agenda, and resources for action on climate mobility in the continent. During our panels today, ACMI principals and partners will share their expectations for this joint initiative as we work towards COP27. We will then turn to experts to discuss current climate mobility dynamics and responses in Africa and efforts underway to understand and analyze future movements amidst the climate crisis. It's my pleasure to introduce our first panelist of the day, Ms. Sandra Brecker, the Chief Executive of the Bosch Stiftung. The Bosch Stiftung has been an early and central supporter of the ACMI, and we are very deeply grateful to have you with us today and also for all the support extended so far. Ms. Brecker, I pass the floor to you, and I just make a note that the full bios of all panelists will be posted in the chat function. Thank you. Over to you, Ms. Brecker.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon from Berlin. Ladies and gentlemen, dear partners, as we're waking up to some progress and commitments made at COP26, yet by far insufficient to tackle the enormous global challenge of the climate crisis, I'm very encouraged to join you today, the first day of work towards COP27, to stress that there is no room for pause in our efforts to safeguard the planet, build resilience, and protect those at the front line of the global climate crisis. The current focus on emissions reductions and mitigation will not suffice. As we strengthen efforts for zero net emissions, it is critical that the world prioritizes climate adaptation and the resilience of affected communities. It is time to put people at the heart of climate action. Regrettably, adaptation finance accounts for barely a quarter of total climate finance flows, and promises to meet adaptation finance commitments to developing and less developed countries are yet to be met. In particular, there is a large gap in adaptation finance for cities that are on the front lines of both rapid urbanization and increasingly severe climate hazards. Therefore, at COP26, we have just announced our commitment to support city-led initiatives on inclusive climate action in Africa. This investment will launch a new chapter of the Global Cities Fund in partnership with the Mayors Migration Council and C40 cities. Our hope is that this initiative will encourage governments and philanthropic funders to join us in this effort. If adaptation continues to be neglected in the climate action equation, the international community's promise to leave no one behind is doomed to fail. We know that the countries and communities that have contributed the least to climate change are set to face the worst of its impact. And Africa ranks at the top of the world's most climate vulnerable regions and is warming faster than the global average. Yet it has contributed only a very small share of CO2 emissions worldwide. Within communities, the particular vulnerability of women, children, the elderly, and marginalized populations is well documented and demands urgent action. As climate impacts are getting more severe, forced migration is emerging as a human face of the climate crisis. Last year alone, some 30 million persons were displaced as a result of disasters. Though predictions come with uncertainty, current modeling efforts predict a future of much larger movements that our current cooperation systems are unprepared to manage and politics are unprepared to face. More frequent and severe extreme weather events, water scarcity, lower crop yields, sea level rise, and environmental degradation threaten sustainable development and the livelihoods of millions in the continent and could uproot millions of people in the future. The sheer scale of these impacts could undermine hard-fought progress in development, stability, and economic growth. That is why we at the Robert Bosch Stiftung joined the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative as a strategic partner. The initiative is an unprecedented partnership to generate data, a clear policy agenda, and implementation capacity. The AU's continental integration agenda and aspirations for the free movement of people hold significant potential for advancing Africa's collective resilience and prosperity in the face of the climate crisis. Migration is an age-old human strategy to adapt to changing environmental and economic conditions. Africans across the continent resort to mobility to bolster their families' resilience in the face of shocks and crises. Movements in the context of the climate crisis can be harnessed to advance the ambitions of the continent for further integration and mobility, common prosperity, and strengthened resilience. However, this will require new partnerships and collaborations on all levels designed for a continent on the move. We are convinced that the ACMI can inject momentum in the African climate action agenda by supporting the development of an African narrative in the global fight against climate change, a narrative which is urgently needed. We look forward to working closely with the ACMI and all its partners as it advances data-based and comprehensive solutions to support people-centered adaptation to climate mobility, protect those on the move, and further the resilience of African communities confronting the climate crisis. As we press forward our efforts toward people-centered climate action and redouble adaptation efforts and financing, I would like to stress 3 principles for our engagement. First, actions should be informed by local needs and grounded in the continent's ambitions. Climate adaptation happens locally. People who are forced to move as the result of the climate crisis tend to move over short distances. They largely remain within their country or region. We fully support the ACMI in pursuing a context-specific understanding of climate risks and vulnerabilities and its commitment to press for the development of responses and capacities that are locally owned. Second, responses to climate mobility must be guided by data and evidence. We are very encouraged by ACMI's approach to harness data collection, field research, and state-of-the-art modeling techniques by both the Columbia University and the Mixed Migration Center, both partners of ours, to identify hotspots on the continent where significant population changes in response to climate impacts may occur and are very likely. Such an approach will help planners, policymakers, and stakeholders at all levels and across sectors to proactively identify trends, geographies, and populations of concern, and work towards well-informed responses and solutions that can put communities on a more resilient and sustainable trajectory. Third, the scale of the task requires us to break the usual silos and to pursue new partnership structures. We are committed to supporting the ACMI's efforts to build a community of practice and to sustain a capacity for collaboration among communities facing similar challenges, as well as strengthening the dialogue across all levels of governance, stakeholders, and policy ecosystems. The ACMI and its partners can count on the full support of the Robert Bosch Stiftung as a strategic partner to the initiative to advance the objectives of resolving some of the most pressing issues that we are facing today. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Ms. Brecker, and especially for highlighting the need for data-based and people-centered approaches, which is, of course, what we're looking at today and want to focus on today with our panelists. Thank you again. I move us forward and pass the floor to our second speaker, Mr. Simeon Ehui, the Regional Director for Sustainable Development for Africa at the World Bank, which is also a core partner of the ACMI. And we thank you, Mr. Ehui, for being with us today. Please, sir, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you, Sarah. Good morning and good afternoon, dear distinguished panelists and ladies and gentlemen. I hope you hear me very well. Good. It is really an honor to contribute to this event. Mobility is not new in Africa. It has been happening for centuries within and across borders and from rural to urban area for economic, educational, commercial, political, and social reasons. Mobility has often contributed to prosperity, to growth, and serve as an adaptation strategy. We are now witnessing the potency for climate change to drive mobility and influence mobility patterns in communities. Why is this one different now? The rules have changed because of the need to respond to the impact of decreased crop yield, rising sea levels, water scarcity, and the increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. The challenge before us is to ensure that climate impact like these and the associated migration do not roll back development gains. We need to ensure that they do not derail countries' plan to achieve desired sustainable development outcomes. Understanding how climate change will affect migration is important. Create policies that match the need and reality of economies and communities in Africa. This is why the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative is timely. However, to succeed, we must collaborate with countries and partners while putting people at the center. Since the launch of this initiative, I'm pleased to share that the World Bank has published the Groundswell Africa reports. These provide more granular data on how climate change will impact internal mobility. These reports show that without well-planned climate and development action by 2050, West Africa and the Lake Victoria Basin could see internal climate migrants within their countries reach up to 32 and 38 million respectively. By taking immediate and concerted action to reduce global emission and by supporting green, inclusive, and resilient development, we could significantly reduce the scale of climate migration by up to 60% in West Africa, for example. At the same time, far-sighted policies and planning can usher in social and economic transformations and reduce vulnerabilities. This means harnessing economic opportunities in less climate-sensitive sectors. This means investing in human capital for green growth by furthering education and developing skills. Groundswell Africa provides actionable policy and operational responses that countries can domesticate and adapt to harness the opportunities of climate mobility. Shaping the future of mobility in Africa depends on policies on the ground and on placing communities and people at the center of climate action. Leveraging enhanced knowledge and analytics is key to this. Allow me to highlight a few examples. First, the ongoing 250 million West Africa Coastal Program, known also as WACA, is helping to build the resilience of coastal communities in 6 African countries, It has helped to leverage partnership, bringing green jobs and also business opportunities. The second example is this 150 million financing locally led climate action, known as FLOCA. It's a program in Kenya. It's the first of its kind in Africa, and it's a program that we are developing in Kenya. It is a nationwide program that aims to build local resilience in all of Kenya's 47 counties with a focus on arid and semi-arid lands. It will support climate resilient livelihoods through investment at the community level in natural resource management and water supply. The climate migration diagnostics we prepared will inform this engagement. The third example is that we have committed 5.6 billion to support 11 countries which are part of the Green Wall initiative. This investment will build climate resilient communities by creating corridors of growth from Senegal to Djibouti. Climate change is accelerating at an increasingly fast pace. Our actions and responses need to outpace this escalating impact if we want to reduce the potential vulnerabilities that affected our communities. Cooperation and step-up action by development, humanitarian, and security communities are key to pursuing more holistic and durable solutions. Let us also leverage the private sector, which is working across the mobility continuum. Dear participants, I wish you all good luck in this initiative, and we look forward to working together. Over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hui. Thank you for stressing both the resilience side of climate action, but also the growth and opportunity side and the mobility opportunities that are linked to that. I'd like to pass now to our next distinguished speaker, the Honorable Mayor of Dakar, Ms. Soham El Wardini. Welcome, Madam Mayor. Thank you for joining us. We're very pleased that we have mayors and cities as a key constituency of the ACMI, and we look forward to your remarks, which I understand will be delivered in English. Madam Mayor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I would like to salute Madam Director of Operations of the International Organization for Migration, Madam Director of the Robert Bosch Foundation, Mr. Regional Director for Africa for Sustainable Development at the World Bank, dear guests, distinguished participants. First of all, I would like to express my sincere thanks to the organizers of this session and the initiators of the African Climate and Mobility Initiative. This new multi-stakeholder initiative is of paramount importance and resonates with all the climate change related programs initiated by the city of Dakar. It is therefore a pleasure for me to participate in this session on climate mobility in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, indeed, climate change strongly impacts the urban environment of our cities and slow down economic activity. Like other continents, Africa is affected by extreme meteorological disasters such as drought, coastal erosion, landslide, sea level rise, and advancing sea level, which encourage migration. For these reasons, states and cities should integrate migration into their climate adaptation strategies. In Dakar, for example, we are experiencing strong population growth due to sustained urban migration and a natural growth rate of 20.51%. With its geomorphology and rapid urbanization, Dakar is faced with many shocks and constraints that greatly exceeds its capacity to provide adequate services and quality living conditions to its residents, and exposes it to the risk of climate change and thus to the migration of its inhabitants. Similarly, rising sea levels and coastal erosion threaten beaches and may lead to the displacement of population in infrastructure along the coast. This observation led the city of Dakar to take the lead very early by becoming the first African city, along with Durban, to join the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities Network. Dakar is also among the first cities in Africa to implement an urban resilience strategy through the Dakar Resilient City Program. And since March 2021, the city of Dakar has had a territorial climate and energy plan, PCET, the first to be adopted by a city in the sub-region, thanks to funding from the European Union through the Covenant of Mayors in Africa. The city of Dakar, PCET, integrates the themes of climate energy, urban planning, risk and disaster management, and living environment, but also the development of renewable energies, energy saving in municipal buildings and public lighting, the promotion of soft modes of transport, a circular economy, and the development of green spaces for a healthy living environment. It aims to set in motion a new dynamic of taking charge of the climate in Lekong planning and to help to better understand and manage the risk linked to climate change through better capacity building in the city's actors. We must therefore recognize that climate change is a factor of migration and integrate it into urban planning for implementation of strong measures and the sharing of experience between local authorities. This year, I was honored to join a group of pioneers marrying from around the globe to form an international work in climate and human mobility with the support of the MMC and C40. This joint effort is based on the premise that cities are at the forefront of climate and migration challenge, and that when mayors join forces and speak with one voice, they have the ability to influence the political agenda of their national and international counterparts. For example, Senegal has always been a departure and a transit point for migration abroad. Dakar is also a new home for national and international migrants, many of whom move from climate-related reasons. 60% of internal migrants in Senegal come to Dakar. On the other hand, climate change poses a considerable challenge with the city of Dakar itself. Rising sea levels and coastal erosions threaten between 12 and 19 communities on the Atlantic waterfront. In addition, extreme rainfall events are a recurring risk for our city, where thousands of people have already been forced or permanently flooded. Last week at COP26, to publish concrete recommendations for national government and international organizations to support cities and work with municipalities to provide meaningful responses to climate change and cities with better access to climate change for adaptation, especially in the South, while encouraging central governments to accelerate the transfer of power to municipalities, especially in urban planning and land use. There are issues like Dakar, as well as for many cities where climate-related human mobility intersect with pre-existing social vulnerability, while rapid and urbanization exponentially increases exposure to climate risk. I would like to take the opportunity to welcome the Foundation to support a new chapter of the Global Cities Fund focusing on inclusive climate action in African cities. Cities are often laboratories for change in addressing these challenges, and initiatives such as the Global City Fund are essential to support good practices put in place by local government, which too often lack predictable resources to be scaled up and replicated everywhere else. With the COP27 taking place in Africa, I see the African Climate Mobility Initiative as a crucial opportunity to work with national government, the United Nations and multilateral organizations, as well as other local government in the region, as I invite other mayors to join us in developing inclusive responses to climate and mobility that put people at the center of our action. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mayor Alvardini. We had some connection problems in the middle of your intervention, but I think we will be able to make the speech available also in writing for those who did not capture it all. Thank you very much, though, for highlighting some of the challenges, but also some of the actions that mayors are already taking. And we are very much looking forward to working with cities and looking at urban areas as part of the ACMI. I now turn to Ms. Aissata Khan from the IOM, who's the Senior Regional Advisor for Sub-Saharan Africa, and who's joining us this morning as the Deputy Director General. Ms. Ugoche Daniels unfortunately had to attend to an emergency. So thank you, Aissata, for stepping in, and thanks to IOM for being such an unwavering partner to the ACMI. We very much look forward to your intervention. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you for informing about the unavailability of DDG Daniels because of another meeting, urgent one. And I have the honor and the pleasure to deliver her remarks. So many of my previous followers have already set the scene on the impact of climate change in the African continent. And as we know, today floods and storms are visibly fueling disaster displacement in Africa. And in 2020 alone, some 4.3 million people were internally displaced by disaster across sub-Saharan Africa. But this is only capture one part of the picture, actually. Land degradation, as we saw, water scarcity, sea level rise had and will continue to have the strong impact on human mobility in the region. Despite the continent being the least contributor on greenhouse gas emissions, it has been and continues to be the most impacted by the effect of climate change. I am really glad that we have this today, the opportunity to understand our takeaways from the COP26, which has just ended, in terms of addressing migration and displacement in the context of climate change. We are also very clear, and we know that our windows of opportunity to prevent the worst climate impacts is rapidly closing, including on migration. No region is immune, as we said, and as we have seen, and that includes the African continent. Africa countries have also showed commitment in the effort to adapt to and mitigate impacts of climate change and deal with the climate change-induced mobility as it relates to its development, economic and political integration. All Africans are also signatory of the Paris Agreement. They showed their involvement and engagement on climate action, and they are being implemented across their countries as well. Many have also endorsed the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. Here we want to deliver some migration-related message from the COP26 to the COP27, which would be, we hope, the African momentum to addressing climate change. We are still analyzing the discussion from 26, but we came back with 4 prospective takeaways and messages for the COP27. First, the climate science is very clear. Meeting the target of 1.5 degrees is crucial. It is the best way to protect the humanity from the dangerous effect of climate change, including on migration. On this point specifically, we welcome COP new engagement adopted on Saturday, November, very evening, on the general phasing out of fossil fuels, notably coal, which will definitely contribute to the reduction of gas emission and subsequently to the temperature rise. Hopefully, this will allow the now annual revision of the target greenhouse gas emission as soon as 2020. But more efforts are still due in COP27 on these 2 points. The second point that I wanted to highlight is that we need to put the most vulnerable at the center of our discussion, as Sandra has already highlighted. We need to ensure the safety, the health, social welfare for those affected by climate change. We can do this via strong policies and governance on climate change that include migrant and displaced persons. 2 points in this second point. The human mobility discussion in Glasgow were scarce, unfortunately, and only indirectly framed in the loss and damage discourse on climate change, with an insufficient focus on the displacement type of mobility in the context of climate change. And B, this shows the urgency to help people on the move already, but also the need to focus even more on adaptation to minimize and avert further displacement where it is still possible. The third point that I want to make here is that this brings me to speak to the adaptation to climate change that is equally important to climate change mitigation. Some of the climate change already happened, and we will not be able to mitigate them anymore, which is why we need to increase support for climate change adaptation action, measures and resources to adverse and minimize displacement to strengthen people resilience. In Africa, we also need to leverage the contribution of women, youth, diaspora, and migrants to take climate action and build resilience of communities. Climate funds have to support African governments, cities, as the mayor of Dakar has just outlined, and their population to manage climate-induced human mobility and its effect on rapid urbanization and urban and rural migration. On this point specifically, the Glasgow Pact decision of doubling the means targeted to the adaptation from now onward is much welcomed. It is a great move for Africa and other vulnerable regions of the world as far as its practical mechanisms are urgently put in place. The final point is that we heard that sustainable and predictable climate finance is the basis of achieving all this work. We need to move from inevitable pledges to concrete and direct contribution that will support the most vulnerable first. This means more climate financing for adaptation, but also loss and damage associated with the climate change. In this final point, we have 3 points that we wanted to stress. Actors need to facilitate access to climate funds in a 50-50 equal split between adaptation and mitigation. Financing to ensure that 50% of adaptation fund goes to the most vulnerable countries, LDCs, SEEDs, and African countries. Second, the common but differentiated responsibility and respective capacity of actors need to be acknowledged, but also addressed. More loss and damage funding could help in this sense. During the COP26, reference were also made to the importance of leveraging investment in early green development, on the strategic use of fossil fuel revenues to strengthen climate resilient activities, including renewable energies and adaptation of vulnerable sectors like water and agriculture. On this point specifically, we can regret that no decision was finally taken in Glasgow, backed to address loss and damages needs in a specific facility or fund. Toward the COP27, looking at it in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt in November 2020, we hope that this discussion can be concluded with satisfactory decisions on loss and damages compensation for all vulnerable countries, including Africa. We sincerely hope that COP27 will generate a greater focus on the continent's challenges, nature-based solutions, and opportunity ranging from natural resources management and dividend, biodiversity conservation and economic growth, energy transition, and green economy. We also expect a greater focus on all forms of human mobility, including migration, displacement, and planned relocation. This would ensure that we are leveraging the role of migrants that have to play in climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, either via diaspora engagement, remittance, green jobs, or activities in host communities. Equally important, this would mean that states connect the commitment they made under the Paris Agreement with those they made under the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, and consider a coherent implementation plan. In conclusion, I cannot but re-emphasize the call made African head of state and government during the general debate of the 76th session of the UN General Assembly. They made clear that given fragility linked to climate change is an aggravating factor in conflict and humanitarian crisis, COP26 must send a strong signal for the reaffirmation of political will to combat the effect of climate change. We know today that we are still to see tangible results. Therefore, the African leaders' recommendation that during the COP27 in Egypt, African narrative and perspective are taken more into account in formulation global action, climate action, it is more relevant than ever. I thank you, Sarah, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Aissata. Thank you for highlighting some of the achievements from Glasgow, but also the many chapters of work that really need to advance still, and the opportunity that is ahead of us in Sharm el-Sheikh. We are a little bit behind schedule, so I'm concluding here this high-level panel. I'd like to thank again our principals and partners for their engagement and for their time this afternoon. And I'd like to pass the floor to our moderator for the first expert panel, which is entitled Understanding Climate Mobility Dynamics and Responses in Africa. And I welcome Professor François Gémen. Probably many of you know him. He's an expert in environmental geopolitics and migration dynamics. He teaches at Sciences Po and other universities, is the director of the Hugo Observatory at the University of Liège, and also co-directs the Observatory on Defense and Climate of the French Ministry of Defense. I understand that Professor Gémen may have to leave us at some point, so he will be co-moderating with his colleague, Dr. Caroline Zigraf. Welcome, Caroline, as well, who is the Deputy Director of the Hugo Observatory. And I welcome you both and pass the floor to François. If he is still here. François, do we still have you with us? I saw him before. Do we have Caroline with us?
I am here. François says that he's here as well. Perhaps he's put on as an attendee and not a panelist. Maybe it's switched him because he says he's with us.
He was speaking before, right? So I'm trying to see if I.
It says they've muted him.
I just brought Francois back in as a panelist.
There we go.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Francois.
All right. Yeah, there we are. It was, sorry, I was there and it was extremely frustrating because my mic was actually switched off. So yes, thank you, Sarah. So as you said, I will be moderating this panel with Caroline Zigraft. Caroline is the Deputy Director of the EU Observatory, and she has done a lot of work in Africa, and probably some of you must know her as well. She's a specialist of immobility, which is an extremely important issue when we consider the dynamics of mobility in Africa as well. We're running late, and I know this, so I will keep it really short by way of introduction. Just to say that I've heard a lot of focus on COP26 and on COP27. And of course, the outcome of COP26 were extremely disappointing. And I think it's a betrayal, really, of the African countries by industrialized countries. And I really want to encourage African countries to really claim more attention given to adaptation and loss and damage at COP27, at COP28, and further. But at the same time, I think that we cannot rely only on COPs to advance this issue. As many have said, there are very salient issues in Africa when it comes to climate change and mobility on the continent, and we cannot hope too much from the COP. And clearly, I don't think that the solution will come from the COP. I don't think that we can wait for positive outcomes of the COP to basically provide policy responses to the people already being displaced as a result of climate impact. So in this panel, we will be looking at the different forms, the different patterns of mobilities related to climate change in Africa. This is an expert panel, as you said, Sarah. Because of my blunder regarding the schedule, I will need to leave you in the course of the panel, but Caroline will be able to take over. And so without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our first expert, Jane Lineker from the Mixed Migration Center. So Jane, the floor is yours. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. What I wanted to do in the few minutes that I have is to talk a little bit about what we're doing in terms of field research for ACMI. What we're doing, the people we're speaking to, and some of the things that we're starting to find out. And I want to start with underlining that we don't know enough about the link between climate change in mobility. And so we're really excited to be part of this data-driven, people-centered approach to Africa and in Africa Climate Mobility Initiative. And if we don't know enough, we're in danger of oversimplifying the situation. So our aim is to better understand where mobility lies among people's responses to the impact of climate change, because it can be one of many, and where climate-related events and climate change lie as a factor in people's decision-making around mobility. As has been said, Africa is a very mobile continent, so there's already a lot of mobility going on, and where does climate change lie within that? So what we wanted to do was to take a very broad look at all kinds of mobilities, not just emergency, urgent displacement, but also people's voluntary decisions to make a new life elsewhere, or their decision to migrate perhaps only seasonally, to move abroad or to move locally. And perhaps even more important, to look at immobility too, so to look at people who cannot move or do not want to move. And we also wanted to take a look at a broad range of settings, all kinds of types of climate-related events and different kinds of livelihoods, so we can just try and understand the scope of what is happening. So who did we speak to? We realized that we don't have the time or the resources to directly compare every situation. So what we're doing is looking at a few specific case studies, and we identified locations that are affected by climate-related events, and locations which are linked, most cases, to climate change, and also places where we have some evidence of some kind of mobility and movement. Now, these places that we selected we consulted extensively with many people on where to go, and we really wanted to be complementary to existing research, to things that are already going on in a spirit of collaboration. So we're really data-driven, evidence-driven, and we're using and building as much evidence as possible with others at the same time. Where we've ended up is looking at 3 cities, informal settlements in 3 cities affected by flooding and rising seas. So we're looking at Lagos in Nigeria, Alexandria in Egypt, and Beira in Mozambique. And we're also doing field research at the edges of 2 small towns, one affected by drought and dryness in Angola, and one affected by drought and flooding in Malawi. And then we're looking at 2 entirely rural areas, which are affected by unpredictable rains, which often means dryness for the populations, sedentary farmers in Karamoja in Uganda, and nomadic pastoralists in Senegal. And we've done a mixture of a survey and more qualitative research to allow comparison across these cases, but still enabling understanding of the context and nuance, and to have some inclusivity and reach particular population groups. Of course, like any field research and study, our work has its limitations and decisions had to be made. But what we're hoping is what we have is complementary to both the large-scale modelling that our partners are doing and other people are conducting, and the in-depth granular studies of specific places that are also being carried out and have been in the past. What we've also done is, because we've needed to find evidence of climate impact across a broad range of locations, is that we're often speaking to a particularly vulnerable community. As we said, we're looking at the most vulnerable of a larger vulnerable community. These impacts are compounding. So what are we learning? Our findings are far from complete, but there are a few points that I wanted to raise right now that have been suggested by some of the other speakers already. Yes, Africa is a highly mobile continent, but immobility is also a really important aspect that we have to take into account. People who cannot move and want to move, or people who don't want to move, or people who cannot even conceive of moving. Many people don't move, and this seems to be the case even among populations who are being negatively impacted by environmental stressors. Another point is that mobility often requires resources. And when it happens, those resources can determine the type of movement that people engage in. Movement does tend to be local and does tend to be to a city, which reflects the urbanization that's occurring across the continent as important for cities, as we've already been hearing. We're not sure about the level of cross-border movement, and we're interested in perhaps exploring more, and it's a work for further exploration, is the idea of onward migration or step migration. So what are these journeys like? Is there an initial journey and then a future journey across borders? And where does climate change lie as a driver in these different steps and the journeys? And then different people are moving, depending on livelihoods, depending on household setup, and depending on the type of climate impacts that are being felt. This will influence who is moving how, as well as how and where. And finally, a point that bears repeating, that I say often, is that people move for different reasons. That the impacts of climate-related events and climate change are stressors, and they add to other reasons, and they underlie other reasons. So there's more than one thing going on, which comes back to the idea of this complexity and having to understand much better and appreciate the full complexity of the link between climate change and mobility. And it's great that we can start doing this here as part of ACMI to complement so much that is going on elsewhere. And with that, I will stop and back to Francois.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Jane. And with that, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end after all interventions. I would like now to turn to Dr. Adeola from the University of Pretoria. Dr. Adeola, you work in particular on the issue of internal displacement, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here and speak about the issue of climate change and mobility. For my presentation, I'll be speaking about the regional legal landscape around climate change. But I think it's sort of useful to sort of give some context. What we currently know is that at least about 70% of countries that are facing the threats of the climate crisis are in Africa, and already about a quarter of that, specifically 8 out of the 33 of the extremely high-risk countries, have very high levels of displacement, which more than 5% of the population displaced. And already we're being, told that the world reached, 1 degree in 2017, and there is about a 20% probability that the 1.5 degrees will be exceeded by 2024, so 1 year within that period. And evidently what this significantly tells us is that there's a need for us to think through concerns and solutions over the next couple of years. Now, already we sort of see reports also highlighting the fact that about 140 million people will move internally within countries, and at least 86 million people will move internally within sub-Saharan Africa. And this is really based on a World Bank study that really sort of reflects on this. And while the study tends to sort of conflate mobility with displacement in a sense, so it sort of talks to migration and displacement, the projections really reinforce a pertinent concern. And moreover, if we sort of reflect on this figure within the context of current statistics relating to displacement on the continent due to conflict and other pertinent issues, we're beginning to see a serious displacement crisis evidently resonate if we don't have solutions in terms of reversing the current trends. And hence it is relevant for us to begin to critically reflect on sustainable solutions. And one of the areas where we've been speaking, or rather we've seen solutions really being discussed on the continent in relation to the law and policy dimension. So the legal pathways for us to begin to significantly address these issues. Now, just quickly sort of reflect on 3 areas. So refugee law, migration, but then also more importantly, internal displacement. And I'll try to do that very quickly. And now with respect to refugee law, what we've seen over the last couple of years is the fact that there's a growing interest in using the regional refugee framework, so the 1969 OU Refugee Convention, in addressing issues of climate change and potential cross-border displacement. Now, I just want to sort of highlight the fact that at the 2019 roundtable on addressing root causes of forced displacement and achieving global solutions in Africa, which was organized by the AU Commission, one of the pertinent summary outcomes was the fact that the regional definition in the 1969 Refugee Convention may allow decision makers to recognize refugee status in the context of climate change, but of course, there are discussions around how that can occur. And just to sort of highlight the fact that the Refugee Convention, so the OAU Refugee Convention has an expanded definition, in addition to the 1951 UN Refugee Convention definition that also recognizes that every person who, owing to seriously disturbing public order, it could be considered as a refugee. And if you look at that particular phrase, event seriously disturbing public order, you really don't see a listed categorization. So it's really, in a sense, fluid and open to pertinent discussions. But again, the narrative of public order, which is central to that particular thesis, also has this sort of fluid across various legal contexts and jurisdictions as well. So there's a lot of opportunity there to really reflect on how to use that framework. And evidently also when you think around the fact that the UN Human Rights Committee, for instance, in the Ion and Tediosa case versus New Zealand, actually also sort of reinforced, or rather emphasized the narrative of non-refoulement, which is cardinal to international refugee law within the context of climate change and displacement. You really then begin to see that there are these progressions that are evidently laudable to see. And evidently, I just want to highlight what the committee said in saying that without robust national and international efforts, the effects of climate change in receiving states may expose individuals to a violation of their rights, thereby triggering the non-refoulement obligation of sending states. And in the African region, what we've seen is really a reception of mixed populations. So those that are affected by conflict and climate change, for instance, from Ethiopia and Somalia into Kenya. So, but we've not really seen, climate change specifically within the context of refugee law. But of course, this is also in part due to the fact that there's significant guidance also needed for states to be able to engage with this particular instrument in the furtherance of protection for persons displaced by climate change across borders. But then within the context of migration, however, we're beginning to see some pertinent progress. So particularly when you think about free movement arrangements. And I just wanted to highlight specifically the IGAD protocol, which reinforces the need for IGAD member states to allow citizens of another member state who are moving in anticipation of, during or in the aftermath of disaster, to enter into their territories, provided that upon arrival they shall be registered in accordance with national law. So there's a whole level of conversations there around the fact that this could be an opportunity for protecting persons who are affected by climate change. However, it's really in the context of internal displacement that we've seen the most progress on the continent, and specifically, this specifically comes from the regional framework on internal displacement, which is the African Union Convention for the Protection and Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons, which specifically protects persons affected by disasters, including climate change. So it really reinforces climate change as a root cause of internal displacement. And there are really 4 specific dimensions of movement and patterns that we've seen on the continent. So there's displacement due to onset natural disasters, slow onset, sudden onset, slow onset, climate-related conflicts, and climate development-induced displacements. And in terms of national legal frameworks, we've seen significant progress with respect to countries such as, for instance, South Sudan, Nigeria, and Somalia, specifically including climate change in the context of frameworks on internal displacement. However, there's really still much work to be done in terms of law and policy. If you think around the fact that about at least 31 countries have actually ratified the OU and the Kampala Convention, which is on internal displacement. But then I'll just really like to reflect on just 2 key recommendations I think it could be useful to think through. Of course, I'd like to echo the fact that we still need data, and data is pertinent in order to provide a contextual reflection on the number of persons displaced within borders and across borders due to climate change, and of course, even in engaging with states in order for them to see the pertinence of using those frameworks to reinforce protection for the persons that are displaced. But then, more importantly, we need to develop regional guidance specifically around the issue of climate change and mobility. So how do we use the laws that exist to foster protection for IDPs, for within the context of climate change, for refugees, persons who are displaced across borders, but then also, within the context of migration. So I think there's that opportunity there. And, when we sort of leverage that opportunity, it will provide us with a pertinent way of really developing solutions from a regional perspective, particularly from law and policy dimension in the furtherance of protection for persons within the context of climate change and mobility. Thank you very much. And I look forward to further engagements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it is now my pleasure to yield the floor to Benjamin Garou, who's actually the only male speaker in our panel, so in charge of the gender parity of the panel. And Mr. Garou works at the East African Center for Forced Migration and Displacement. So, Mr. Garou, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Mr. Garou, you're still muted. You need to unmute your mic.
Yes. Sorry about that. Yeah,
sorry about that.
Thank you. So as I was saying very briefly, after listening to Dr. Romola's work and her interventions in respect to the legal regimes from the Kampala Convention to the expanded definition in the OAU Convention, I wanted to very briefly reflect on what we are witnessing as practitioners on the ground in Kenya, where I am joining you from today, as well as in the region, and then thereafter talk about how our work feeds into and contributes to the evidence base, as well as then supports the policies and access to international protection. So very briefly, what I will start by saying that, as noted in this forum, the adverse effects of climate change are often exacerbated by other factors, and most of them are socioeconomic, most importantly being the inequalities that exist, poor governance, scarce resources, fragile ecosystems, political or religious tensions, and in some cases leading to violence, as has been seen, for example, in the northern frontier districts of Kenya and the larger Horn of Africa, specifically affecting the pastoral communities of the Borana region in Ethiopia, the Isiolo County in Kenya, as well as the Katakwina Park border region in northeastern Uganda. As we speak today, and as a journey from Kenya, climate change is causing devastating socioeconomic impacts, especially through severe droughts and rain pattern shifts in Kenya. In South Sudan, we are witnessing floods, desertification, rising water levels, for example, in Lake Tanganyika and River Rusizi in Burundi, where we currently have roughly 103,000 persons internally displaced at the Kiramango IDP camp. The floods in South Sudan, mostly in Jonglei, Upper Nile, and the Unity States have displaced roughly 780,000 persons since May this year, according to Watcher. So that's what we are seeing on the ground. In Kenya in specific, and the greater IGAD region, the climate prediction application system has confirmed what we're already witnessing, rain pattern shifts and droughts. And what we are witnessing on the ground right now is that we have the driest October to December rainy season on record, and significant increases in food security are expected. It is expected that we will receive the lowest rainfall on record since 1981 across much of Eastern Africa, the southern Somalia, and the Lebanon zone of Ethiopia. Further down in Angola, the situation is quite similar. Beyond Beira in Mozambique, where the MMC had done their mapping, we noticed that in Angola, the country is experiencing its worst drought in 40 years. And in some municipalities in the south, 1 out of 2 persons are food insecure. And then this brings me to the policies and the legislation. Against this background, our domestic policies and legislation continue to operate in silos. For example, Kenya's Climate Change Act, number 11 of 2016, makes not even a single reference to climate-induced mobility. On the other hand, in Uganda, Uganda's National Climate Change Act, which was assented to on the 14th of August this year, also operates without appreciating the nexus between climate change on one hand and displacement induced as a result of climate on the other. However, as Dr. Romola has expounded, initiatives such as this, together with instruments such as the Kampala Convention and the expanded OAU definition, may offer opportunity to remedy this situation. In regards to accessing international protection, whether at the national stage, where most displacement and mobility is expected, or at the international stage, what is required is a broader outlook on the effects of climate change and how they interact with mobility and movement and displacement. Hence, there's need to ensure that the domestic and regional instruments have a cross-sectoral approach in their framework. If a narrow view is taken of the effects of climate change, there's a risk that decision makers, whether at the RSD stage in international protection or other regimes that may exist, might be seen to be inapplicable and deny access to international protection. Now, this is where our work comes in, together with other stakeholders, and allow me to appreciate the role of the Robert Bosch Foundation and the World Bank. Their work and our work is important in promoting a knowledge ecosystem, including indigenous forms of knowledge on climate mobility, the causes and how it interacts with other socioeconomic factors such as inequality and fragile ecosystems, as well as feeding into policy making through an evidence-based approach, as was detailed by representatives from MMC. And when we talk about putting people at the center of action, as we are doing today, this must include displaced persons. We must include them in our programming, in our policy formulation, and include them in our research and advocacy efforts. As I conclude, if you may allow me, one such program that we are working on is the RLO Climate Mobility Ecosystem in Nairobi, a collaboration between ourselves and other stakeholders. And it is a long-term project intended to train, support, and fund refugee-led organizations and graduate refugee researchers interested in working in mobility, on climate change mobility, and equipping them with the skills, tools necessary to ensure that their work feeds into initiatives such as the ACMI and the Mayor's Migration Council, and also translates into effective advocacy programs and ensures that their lived experiences as those closest to displacement is considered when developing policy interventions, legislation to address mobility in our region and beyond. I will stop there because of time. Thank you, and over back to you, Dr. Jimene.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ngaru. And our last speaker for this session is Mrs. Alessandra Casazza from the UNDP Resilience Hub for Africa. And then after your speech, Mrs. Casazza, I will let Caroline take over for the Q&A session. So thanks for being with us. And my apologies that I will need to leave you, but Caroline will take over the moderating role. Thank you to both of you.
Thank you, Francois. Thank you, moderator. And greetings from the UNDP Nairobi Resilience Hub to everyone, to all the colleagues and the partners. So speakers before me have made reference to COP26. We are at the very tail end of it. And we know that last Saturday, the outcome document has just been delivered after going overtime. This is not indeed the venue to discuss the outcome document and to share views, but only to remember that this was a COP that everyone was looking towards to finally help us address the climate crisis. And unfortunately, it fell short of our expectations. So we will have a chance with COP27, but this is to say we are in the middle of a great climate crisis. And we all remember also the words of the UN Secretary General a few months ago when the IPCC report was published. He called it a code red for humanity. And I have to say for Africa, the code is even redder because Africa is the continent, as we know, that is paying the highest price of climate change, having contributed to it the least. Just to think about the fact that we are expecting average temperatures in the continent to reach 3 degrees Celsius by mid-century, with, of course, expected impact on devastating impact on communities and people. But what today concerns us is not so much, I mean, it is, of course, the climate crisis in and of itself, but also the fact that climate change is amplifying and is also multiplying other crises that are related to it. And one of these is that of a forced displacement. And as we expect the climate crisis to worsen, we are also expecting the exacerbation of the climate-induced forced displacement. With this in mind, I would like today to share with colleagues and partners 3 points. I would like to focus on 3 issues. And the first one, for us in UNDP is very important, is the need to better understand the nexus between climate change and human mobility, to be able, of course, to address this issue head on. And we know that environmental migration is definitely a fact. Climate-induced environmental degradation is definitely changing fundamentally changing the map of Africa. Just to share a few figures, only in 2018, more than 2.6 million people were on the move because of drought and cyclones and floods and climate-related disasters. So we do know that there is a relationship between climate change and human mobility. But this is a relationship that is very complex, that is not linear and is not direct, and that we still need to unpack further. The environmental degradation and climate change is only one of the many factors that we know are behind the decisions of people to move, that shape migration and shape migration patterns and dynamics. Migration, the decision to move for people is mainly driven by other factors of political, social, and economic natures that, of course, need to be taken into account. What is different today and what has shed light and a spotlight on climate-induced migration, and this is why we are focusing on it, is the fact that is the scale of it, is the fact that, of course, while climate is only one factor driving migration and displacement, leading people to move, is increasingly playing a very important role. But we need to remember is not the only factor. So to understand this nexus, the nexus between climate change and human mobility, we need, at least we believe in UNDP, we need to move away from what we call the environmental determinist approach to embrace a much more integrated and holistic approach that takes into consideration the political, the social, and also the economic drivers of human mobility. This means investing a lot more in human mobility data and also analysis, because what we have seen is that the more widely available data and analysis on climate, for example, is creating some biases, is drawing conclusions, is overwhelmingly drawing conclusions on the effect of climate-related events on human mobility and the relationship between human mobility and the anthropogenic climate change. So this is to say that if you really want to understand climate-induced mobility, human mobility, we really need to understand what is behind, what influences the decision of people as to whether to move, as to whether and also when to migrate, to stay, or even to return. And this, of course, requires an integrated approach, an integrated analysis that takes into consideration the multiple and interconnected risks that people and community face in their daily life, and also the relationship across these different risks and how they impact decisions of people. So we do believe that the work we are doing under the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative is one that actually can help to shed this light on this nexus, and UNDP is very committed, of course, to continuing working with partners on this. Very briefly, I would like to touch upon two more points. I'll be briefer. And my second point is about the need for an integrated approach to address the climate-induced displacement, because understanding the nexus between climate change and forced displacement has, of course, implications on policy and action. And because, as we have said, you know, the limitations of data and analysis on human mobility and the overwhelming availability instead of climate-related data and analysis, the way in which climate-induced displacement is currently addressed is through the climate change adaptation lens, which is a good lens, but is not the only lens through which, at least we believe, we should approach this issue. Given the integrated and multidimensional nature of the risks and the vulnerabilities that people and community are facing, of course, addressing the root causes of climate-induced displacement from our perspective requires an integrated approach, one that focuses on building resilience, an integrated resilience building, which, you know, beyond climate change adaptation also looks at disaster preparedness, governance and peace building, livelihood and rights-based response. And this is the approach that at least UNDP is advocating to take. And lastly, the third point I wanted to make is the need to have a people-centered approach to addressing the climate-induced displacement crisis, because people, particularly in this continent, in sub-Saharan Africa, will continue moving, either because of necessities and vulnerabilities or because of opportunities. And therefore, we need to bring, again, people at the center of our responses. And for us, this means investing in risk-informed human development, which for us means expanding people's opportunity and choices to live the lives that they want, addressing the risks and the vulnerability that they face. And this is the approach that UNDP is taking on strengthening people resilience and capacity to adapt. And this also includes the choice that people have to move or to stay or to return as an adaptation strategy for the fast changing environment in which they live. Let me just conclude by saying that addressing the issues of climate-induced displacement, of course, calls for investing much more in climate action, and particularly in climate change adaptation. Of course, the next COP, which is an African COP, COP27, will give us an opportunity to further raise the level of ambition that could not be delivered by this current COP. However, we want to say climate is only part of Africa climate-induced human mobility story, and addressing this issue calls for putting people at the very center of the solution, addressing the potential, the full potential of human mobility for development, and offering people the choices and the opportunities to make the decisions on the type of responses that are better in line with their aspirations. Thank you for the opportunity, and over back to you, Madam Chair.
Great. Thank you so much for your intervention. Unfortunately, we are over time on our event, so we don't have time for the Q&A session. However, I'd like to thank all the panelists. I think that we've done well in just a few interventions covering various institutional perspectives, also regional perspectives, the gaps that we're seeking to fill, but also the opportunities that are there. So while we move on to the next panel, I want to thank you. And also, again, I encourage you, if you would like to continue the discussion, to do so within the chat box. And hopefully our panelists can monitor the chat box and respond to any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. And thank you to all our speakers. Please use the chat, as Caroline just mentioned, to post questions and comments. I'd like to pass the floor now to Dr. Kanta Kumari Rigo, who is a lead environmental specialist and regional climate change coordinator in the Africa region of the World Bank. Kanta has played a leading role in the elaboration and implementation of the ACMI so far, and we're very grateful for that. And she's also been the driving force behind the World Bank's groundswell reports that were already mentioned, and I think probably many of you are familiar with. Kanta, without further ado, I pass the floor to you to moderate the second panel on anticipating future climate-forced mobility. Still muted. We can't hear you yet.
Ma'am, we cannot hear you again. So whatever you did earlier to fix the problem, please do the same thing now. We do not hear you.
Whilst we wait for Kanta, I see we have one comment or question in the chat from Nicoletta. No, Cecilia Nicoletti, my apologies, asking about the national implementation of existing international law instruments. So maybe this can be taken up in the next panel. Kanta, are you with us?
Hear me now, Sarah?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry for that technology glitch, but I was just saying thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to all of you for the very interesting conversation that we already started. I know we're running late, and we also have a very interesting and prestigious panel with us. And what I'd like to do is for us to move to that final session, which is going to focus on anticipating future climate-forced mobility. We've heard in the morning about the people-centered climate action from the high-level panel and the issues that are being addressed in the current context. So we'd like to shift gear a little bit, recognizing that we are locked into a certain amount of climate impacts, and those impacts are escalating and amplifying. And so we really want to understand how is it that we can begin to better plan and prepare for that future. I have 4 panelists, and what I'd like to do is to get started right away. And let me first of all invite Mr. Andrew Harper, who is the Special Advisor to the High Commissioner on Climate Action at the UNHCR. I would like each panelist to talk about 2 to 3 minutes and give us your highlights on the issue. And Andrew, what I'd like you to do is you're on the front line of refugee movements and migration, obviously, and share with us, how do you think anticipatory approaches to climate-forced mobility can help us get better prepared for and improve the management of potentially large-scale movements of people? Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Carter. Given the results of COP26, we've got no choice. In the past, humanitarian agencies have worked in a very reactive, siloed manner, as have development agencies, as has peace-building security agencies, as have everyone. So this has to change because we're facing an existential crisis that no one is prepared for. And so but at the same time, we've never had the amount of data, evidence, and need in which to drive this ambition forward. And so what we'd be looking at is to try and use this data and evidence and collaborative manner in order to look at various scenarios and come up with policy recommendations in order that we can be better prepared. So using anticipatory approaches in order to get us ahead of the crisis, but also using much more integrated approaches across the triple nexus plus, because you often look at development, humanitarian, peacebuilding, security, but also the human rights side we need to take into account, because it's not only the climate change that is impacting developments. Some of the other earlier presentations talked about the impact of precipitation, the unknowns in terms of food productivity, heat thresholds, but also other mega trends such as changes in livelihoods. We've got 60% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa, small farm holdings. That's not going to be viable in the future. So you're going to have a major driving towards urbanization. So how is that going to work? So we can use all these various indicators in order to be better prepared so that it's not just humanitarian response, but all these approaches feed into a much more holistic response. And you could see it in COP26. There was a lot of discussions, but I felt it was still very much at almost too general a platform. It was very difficult to come up with specific examples of really what was going to happen on the ground if people did not make the decisions that were required to be made. And I think what we need to do, if we can come up with a common understanding, not exaggerate the various scenarios, but come up with a common understanding of the pathways of what will be the likely impacts in the future, bring it down to the community level, get those community voices to talk directly to policy stakeholders, we may have a better chance in coming up with a conclusion which was a little bit more effective than what we had now. But focus on anticipation, collaboration, transparency, real-time data transfers, but having that ground truth by the communities on the ground and owned by the communities on the ground. It's still very much, I'd say, a northern-led approach to innovative use of data and analysis. We need to be working with the communities on the ground, working with think tanks, providing the statistical officers on the ground with the means in which they can take that ownership in order to inform their own decision making. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I think you've set the stage very well. I mean, challenging us to go from reactive to proactive, from siloed to collective, and to be holistic and integrated, but not forgetting the bottom up. And I think we'll come back to these elements. So thank you very much for setting that stage. Let me now turn to Dr. Alexander de Sherbinin. He's the Associate Director of CSIN in Columbia University. Now, I'll just say what CSIN stands for because I remind myself all the time. It is the Center for International Earth Science Information Network at Columbia, New York. Now, Alex, you know, from the modeling work that you've been so intricately involved in that you have done for the continent, what do you see as the key predictors of climate force mobility in Africa? And where do you think we still have these knowledge gaps? You know, we hear on the one hand that we have too much to do to fill the knowledge gap, but on the other hand, we need to know where we are going. So over to you, Alex.
I hope you can hear me clearly. Good. Yes, we've been working together for a number of years. So it's great to see you and to be on the panel with you. So from the groundswell modeling and for some of the work that we're currently undertaking for the ACMI initiative, we purposely focused on two sectoral impacts: water resources availability and crop production. And we also included sea level rise in the coastal zone. So given the proportion of the population that's dependent on agriculture, as Andrew just pointed out, around 50 to 60% of the population of Africa, climate impacts on rain-fed agriculture are likely to significantly affect livelihoods. This in turn can engender migration following an age-old pattern of dry season migration from drier to wetter regions into urban areas. While in the past, these have largely been sort of temporary or seasonal migrations, eventually those movements can become permanent. So under Groundswell Africa, and for this, the ACMI initiative, we added net primary productivity to the water impacts and the crop production impacts, which this largely applies to semi-arid areas, pastoral areas, and really relates to pastoral kind of livelihoods. So in calibrating the model using historical data, what we find is that the impacts on water availability, that is changes to the abundance or scarcity of surface water resources, not groundwater, are more predictive of shifts in population distribution than variations in crop production. So when we project populations, the future distributions are altered most by changes in water availability. Migrant destination areas almost invariably are areas that are getting wetter, and by extension also increasing to some degree their crop productivity, although that linkage is not always direct. As we've known, excess water and flooding can actually have a negative impact on crop production as well. So one thing we are less able to model is the potential for involuntary mobility, which Jane and others have mentioned several times here. Based on the historical data, if an area gets drier over a longer period of time, people tend to move out. That's what our calibration exercise shows for our work. But there's also contrary research that recently came out with the ebb and flow report from the World Bank that suggests that actually wetter areas tend to send more people because they have more resources. So one thing we don't really know is if there are thresholds beyond which smallholder agriculturalists and nomadic pastoralists will become so impoverished that they may not be able to move on their own. And that's where the involuntary mobility comes in. Also, empirical evidence holds that when people are affected by rapid onset events such as floods, they will typically return after the floods to rebuild their homes and infrastructure. So, for example, in Mozambique, after major floods in the 2000s, when both the Zambezi and the Limpopo rivers overtopped their banks, major resettlement efforts were proposed away from the floodplain, up above, kind of in an area somewhat remote from the floodplain. What happened was most people left those areas of resettlement because their livelihoods were so intertwined with the productivity of those floodplain areas. So, we may try to move people away from areas that are affected, and similar instances have happened in many other parts of the world where flood or typhoon affected areas, you resettle the people away from the coast and then they return because that's where their livelihoods, that's where their jobs are. So I think we need to be very sensitive to the fact that we can come up with the best devised plans, but often people, who are living at the margin of poverty or in poverty are going to return to where the economic resources are. And that, recent evidence from various projects, including a Delta-focused project funded by the International Development Center in IDRC in Canada, basically showed that most people in Delta areas aren't really considering the risks seriously, at least at the present time. Another thing that we've known is that from the Great Sahelian droughts in the 1970s and 80s, these resulted in major expansion of urban areas such as Nouakchott and N'Djamena. Yet today it seems that it is conflict and not so much drought per se that is a major driver of population movements. Work we did recently at the Climate School here at Columbia suggests that conflict is also a bigger contributor to famine than drought itself. So it's really these nexus issues that Andrew kind of touched on that are very difficult. In some ways, we can project some of the climate impacts, we can project potential migration, but knowing how conflict may or may not break out is something that still remains a bit of a black box. So to close, there's uncertainties about what people would do after extreme events. Even our common assumptions about what people would do in response to gradually changing climate need to be empirically validated. So some recent research by colleagues at Oxford University, and also recent literature reviews such as the one that UK Aid produced with Jan Selby, suggests that most people aren't moving as a result of climate impacts. Surveys of migrants in even high-risk regions find that most people are not citing climate factors among the top reasons for moving. Thus, an important question is whether that's because severity of impacts has not yet reached the level that it will under potentially under world of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, or if it's because climate factors are further up the causal chain and people just don't readily identify them as important reasons in comparison to the more proximate factors that determine a move. So those are maybe some confused thoughts, or at least providing the the both and back over to you, Kanda. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I think you really summarized, very nicely in a few minutes, I think how complex the issues are. But I think also the fact that, one continues to probe and advance the thinking and the modeling, but not taking away from the need for empirical evidence on the ground, particularly in terms of decision making, which is so complex. I like the fact that you touched on the threshold issues. I like the fact that it's dynamic and how things have moved from the traditional drought and urbanization to the conflict, because this, I think, is where the issues are very sort of complex, and unpacking them is key. But I think bringing the data and evidence to bear is always a good place to start. So thank you very much for providing us a quick, a tour of the complexity. So it's my pleasure now to move on to Dr. Laura Basco Carrera, who is the Program Manager and the Water Resource Management Advisor at Deltares. Laura, it's a pleasure to see you and to meet with you. I know that Deltares has been doing some fascinating work on water and its linkages to migration through a range of case studies, including some in Africa. Can you share with us, how do we ensure that in modeling possible climate futures, we continue to keep a focus on the needs of the most vulnerable, the climate focus that has come up a few times, and the communities? And if you can share with us briefly on Deltares' work on the participatory modeling, which I think is really important from all the conversations we've had. Over to you, Dr. Laura.
Thank you very much, Kantan. It's a pleasure of being here today. I'm really enjoying the discussions today, and I think we more or less all are living in line. Describing or thinking about what the other speakers and panelists have mentioned, I'm a true believer of informed decision making. What we are saying, all evidence-based climate actions, I really think this is the way forward. And it's good to hear that we are doing a lot of progress in terms of collecting data, using data, and trying to understand exactly how this forced mobility works, what is actually the link with climate adaptation. But as it was mentioned before, it's also about the social, the economic impacts, the other aspects that are not only the climate per se. And here, I think this is a very critical element on this ACMI initiative, but I think as important as that, and this is why I also like the title of this event, which is people. What we have learned at Deltares a lot is if we just focus on the data, if we just focus on the models, at the end, those plans, those actions are not implemented. Why? Because at the end, the technical people will understand the data. There may be some politicians or policymakers will understand the data and maybe will use it, but the most of the people, if we don't engage them in also in this process, at the end, that report is not going to be used. That model, only 2 or 3 persons will use it, and at the end, so much effort is not used at the end. So I think what we have transitioned more is to do, and I like this people-centered approach. So combining the people and combining the models. And this, some people will say, this is very easy to say, but actually, how do you do that? So this is how we call participatory modeling, and Deltalis, we are actually doing it much more and more. And nowadays, we have together globally built a community of practice, because actually we think this is the way forward. But basically what it implies is including the people. And when I talk to people, it can be local communities, it can be the lay people, it can be what we were saying, women, IDPs, refugees, but it can also be local governments, etc. But in the modeling and data process, what does it mean? In data collection, and we were saying with surveys and interviews, but it can also be in the data analysis. It can also be when we then transition from data to the actual modeling. So it can be developing the model, it can be even co-designing parts of the model, or when we are deciding possible futures, let them also think together with us, which possible futures do they see? Now, there are different tools that can be used for that. And when I think about participatory modeling, at the end is a process, because it's a process during that people can be engaged in several aspects of the data and modeling process, but it's also a toolbox, because each group of people have their own skills, their own capacities, their own needs, their own interests, even the regions, they are different. So how do you actually engage them in a way that they all feel then they are accepted, that they have this trust on themselves, that they can speak up, that they have this, at the end they have this ownership on these data and models, but also on the climate actions that will come up. And so this participatory modeling is a kind of a toolbox that contains different kind of methods, different models, but can be coupled with the more complex models, as I call them, the hardcore complex models, but that allows them to make that information a little bit simpler or adapted to the needs and the skills of all the different stakeholders. So, and this we are talking about cognitive mapping. It can be an Asian-based model. It can be a fuzzy cognitive map. It can be group model building. There are many different options, serious games, etc. I'm not gonna, or participatory mapping using OpenStreetMaps. There are many different options, and it's adaptable to each different situation. But then what also I think what is relevant is it helps structuring a stakeholder engagement. Because as we said, there are different stakeholders, and I'm 100% sure that all the different climate actions that will come up as part of this initiative, they will need different actors participating to a certain extent, and also kind of collaborating between them to make that happen. So when we are thinking about structuring participation, it implies, okay, to which level do we allow them to work or to participate? It can be that they just inform, they sit and listen. This can be one, and we are ticking the box of participation, but they are just listening. Is this sufficient for making those actions implementable? I'm not sure. And I can go from here up to 100% when we say no, they are really co-designing parts of the process, because they really have to understand that. And this is one level, the participation, but I want to, and I finalize here, I want to highlight, and it was mentioned before, is also the collaboration part. Because I said participation with this capacity building linked to understanding the model, the data, how the system works now and in the future, only if this is linked to then creating the knowledge bases and the consensus between different stakeholders, then we can actually ensure that these actions that are identified are implementable. And this is what we as the TRIBES, we strongly believe in this participatory modeling approach.
Thank you very much, Laura, for I think really, driving home the point about how to really approach the people-centered approach as in a way. I mean, really unpacking it is from end to end, as I hear you. It's right from the point of data to the modeling and to the almost the solutions and responses as you come up. It's not to present something to them. And this, I think, is becoming really an important way of doing business, this community-led and co-collaboration and co-design that you talk about, I think is the heart of it. And it's the heart of it, especially, I guess, in the context of migration or mobility. It would be impossible to think about how one could do that otherwise. Even while we can have sort of bigger studies that look at patterns and trends, to divorce that process of understanding, unpacking, and even designing responses that can harness community and indigenous knowledge as part of the solutions and even the issues at hand is really paramount. So thank you very much for that set of issues. Now, let me go last but not least to Mr. Jean-Paul Adam, Director of Technology, Climate Change and Natural Resource Management Division at UNECA, which is the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Good to see you again, Jean-Paul. And Jean-Paul, it's your last but not least, because you're going to take us to the bigger picture, working at UNECA and leadership on the Africa side. Can you tell us how you see this anticipatory approach helping the continent to address the climate mobility issues, not just as a risk, but also as that potential opportunity for advancing the continent's integration and development agendas? So over to you, because we think this is really where we all want to get to and look at mobility, not from a victim or from a disadvantageous position, but one that really can deliver. Over to you, JP.
Thank you so much, Kanta, and it's such a great pleasure to participate in this event. And I think in the context of this just concluded COP26, I think we've heard today that African countries in general are dissatisfied with the outcomes of this COP. It's very much a missed opportunity. And somebody even told me it's as if we have a car which is not working correctly, and we are refusing to take the opportunity to fix all the elements that we should fix on the car, and doing the bare minimum to just keep it running, but knowing that the bill is racking up and that we're going to have more problems in the future. And unfortunately, the analogy is not 100% accurate, because it's really existential for so many countries. But I think there is, despite that sort of negative feeling, there's also a feeling of a determination among African countries to do something based on building their own capacities and making a difference themselves. Because even though the COP was disappointing, it was not unexpected. The frequency of extreme weather events has been growing in Africa, and the impact, unfortunately, continues to grow. And the opportunity, I think, is mirrored by the scale of the impact. African countries are often spending up to 9% of their budgets to tackle environmental disasters. In many cases, they're already spending up to 10% of GDP to respond to these kind of disasters. And by 2030, we have estimated that all African countries will probably be spending close to 5% of GDP on climate change, with some outliers, particularly vulnerable areas, spending up to 15% of GDP. And you can imagine that a little bit of climate resilience can build huge opportunities in terms of fiscal space for these resources to be spent elsewhere. And we've seen how those opportunities really translate into results in three key areas that we've looked at in terms of the support we've been giving to African countries on the green recovery. The first one is around energy, where investing in energy is not only linked to the issue of mitigation. Investing in renewable energy is one way to kickstart economies in the context of the green recovery, and also makes areas that are, including rural areas, that are particularly affected or affected by climate change, or particularly liable to be impacted by disasters, to build that resilience. I mean, for example, providing electricity in rural areas that are subject to flooding can often reduce the impact, for example, on deforestation for fuel. And that makes a big difference often in building that resilience against flooding, for example. So energy is one of the first areas that is critical for green recovery because it transforms people's lives and helps them to better address their immediate surroundings. The second area in Africa is agriculture, employs close to 70% of the population. And for those of you who have seen the recent Global Center on Adaptation State and Trends report, it showed that the annual cost of investing in climate resilience through agriculture would be about $15 billion per year, which sounds like a lot, but if you compare it with the estimated cost of $201 billion per year, which is the price tag of paying for disaster relief and floods, that upfront investment has a double benefit of creating sustainable livelihoods, but also building resilience to future shocks. And thirdly, nature-based solutions are one of the key areas which can deliver impacts and positive impacts to mitigate climate change and reduce the impact while also creating livelihoods. And these are activities such as reforestation. In other cases, it may be replanting of mangroves, coastal planting in coastal areas to reduce erosion. And in all of those areas where these kind of investments can be made, our studies have shown a direct linkage with employment, as well as the opportunity for increased value addition, including, for example, developing the context for ecotourism. And our studies showed that you can get, by investing in these three key sectors, energy, agriculture, and nature-based solutions, you can get returns of up to 420% more in terms of value addition compared to fossil fuel-based sectors, and 250% more return in terms of jobs in these sectors. So I think the three key messages that we would put across is, first of all, investing in resilience as an economic strategy and linking that directly with the creation of livelihoods around the creation of that resilience. Secondly, the availability of data and information, weather information in particular, can bring benefits again in a double impact in terms of improved outcomes from, for example, agriculture, as well as reducing the potential impact of flooding or other natural disasters that are linked to climate change. And the third element, of course, is the availability of financing, which is perhaps one of the areas that we are the most disappointed in terms of the outcomes of COP26, that there has not been a firm commitment of how the additional funding beyond 100 billion will be mobilized as of 2025. The needs continue to grow, but there are, again, opportunities for African countries to use their own funding by leveraging, for example, the African Continental Free Trade Area. You can create new opportunities, market-based opportunities for investment in agriculture. The key is to make sure that the agricultural investment is linked to climate resilience and appropriate adaptation. But by some simple opportunities that exist through the African Continental Free Trade Area, for example, phasing out agricultural tariffs could cut undernourishment, which is caused by the impacts of climate change, by up to 64%. So we can use these kind of mechanisms to build market-based opportunities in Africa for investment in these areas that will stimulate green recovery and provide resilience for climate change going forward, and therefore also ensure that any mobility or movement that is associated with climate change is actually linked to livelihoods. And ultimately, that will help to build resilience in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul. I think you brought us back to, I think, the sort of real factors and the underlying factors that actually lead to mobility. And on the converse side, I think the areas that you touched on what is it that we can do to increase the growth, the development, and the prosperity of individuals so that the mobility in converse does not happen. I think the focus on energy is a critical one, and I think the point is really important in the African context where we know that half the population does not have access to energy, and how do we make sure that is done? And it's a pillar of resilience, as you mentioned. And equally, I think the critical importance of agriculture, recognizing also the point that Alex made earlier and Andrew as well, on how important it is that because we are talking about areas of rain-fed agriculture, which are particularly climate sensitive, but looking ahead at some of the solutions that you talk about, including nature-based solutions. So I think this really sets the stage. I think I'm really glad that we've left a few minutes for discussion, and we've heard from all of the 4 panelists and their insights. I do see a couple of questions in the chat line. So what I'd like to do is to frame those 2 questions and then invite the panelists to reflect as they wish on these. There are 2 questions. One is really looking at the issue of the protection side of things, where people have been displaced or where they are refugees and they are moving. How do we think about it? I'm hoping that Andrew would take up the question for anyone else as well. You know, there's a question from Cecilia Nicoletti, who says, could we think of a convention dealing with specific protection gaps and needs of people displaced in the context of climate change and environmental degradation to further develop instrumental law instruments? I know there are a few instruments, processes, and agreements out there. What would this be a value added? Is this a way we want to think about it? So that's one question. The second question, I think, is really getting to the underlying factors that actually cause people to be displaced and thinking about how we address some of these. So the question is from Cecilia as well. And she says, by analyzing this crucial issue, we should not forget, in my opinion, in her opinion, that deforestation, land grabbing, mining, and seabed mining, and the overexploitation of natural resources by national and multinational enterprises are forcing people to leave their homes. So it's really looking at what are the factors that are playing out in the locality where people are. Some of these are climate induced, some of them are amplified by climate change, but some of them are, as we said, this is a complex issue, where there are other factors at play. So I know this probably goes a little bit beyond, but I think it comes back to the bigger issue of how, in the context of future climate forced mobility and the broader mobility, which I know that the ACMI is focusing on, I'd like to hear some reflections from all of you. So maybe what I'll do is I'll start off in the order we spoke, and if everyone can speak very briefly, we'll get a chance to hear from each of you. So over to you, Andrew, and then we'll move to Alex, Laura, and back to JP.
Okay, thanks, Carter. I think it's important to note that the need for international protection, or probably more rightly, regional protection, is already very clear. It may not be addressed, but it's very clear, because 3 times as many people are currently being displaced due to extreme weather events compared to conflict. And so that's already happening. But what's often not taken into account is that the vast majority of people remain within their countries. And so the best thing that anyone can do is provide the capacity that the national authorities can provide the protection for their own populations. And so that could include a normative framework, but it also includes just giving the people the ability to adapt and prepare for what we know is what's going to come down the line. Because what happens is displacement across borders occurs when people have a series of cascading disasters. They don't have the resilience in which to resist, or the resilience and increased vulnerability could lead to conflict, and people can move across the border. So what we have found on one of the best things is that regional and national entities are much more agile in providing legal instruments to provide that protection. And we're seeing this more and more internationally, where you have national jurisprudence coming forward, anticipating the increased challenges. If you talk about the international refugee law, international humanitarian law, these things are, let's say, they move at a pre-industrial glacial pace. So it's going to be very difficult to put in place international instruments referencing climate-induced displacement. It's far better to work with national instruments, regional instruments, and the OAU Convention, the Kampala Convention are probably some of the best ones in the world to address these issues. But the other thing in terms of research is what is important is to not from Geneva or Rome or Washington or New York try and determine what the needs are of the populations on the ground. We need to understand, for instance, that, and I think you mentioned it before, Kanta, that the populations who are being impacted by, who have been most impacted by climate change, often don't have the capacity to move. And so it is, and someone mentioned the immobility. So you've got people who can move. In some aspects, they're in a better position than the most vulnerable populations who have to remain where they are. And so looking at land rights, looking at the position of indigenous populations, disabled groups. So going very much to the communities that are going to be most impacted and sort of saying, okay, how will they adapt in the next 5, 10, 15 years to the situation? Young men will often move. What will happen to the populations that can't? So very, very in-depth required analysis, but let's not all do the same thing. Let's identify what's required and work together. Over.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think you've hit the nail on several issues. I won't summarize in the interest of time. Let me turn to Alex. And if we can all be a little bit more brief, because I'm mindful that we have to close soon. But I think you're, perhaps rather than maybe even answering the questions, which I think are really important, give us your final thought, right? What would be a takeaway message you would like to leave with this panel?
Yeah, well, as I reflected on Cecilia's second point, which was about, the impact of land grabbing and, overexploitation of natural resources. And so Mike Hume, who's a climate scientist in the UK, basically wrote an article called Reducing the Future to Climate, which, is a risk in our world of sort of saying, oh, climate is the most important, and it is, it's a critical issue. We have the Code Red and other pronouncements, and we know that it's going to impact things severely, but we also have parallel developments that are critical. So we need to look at, institutions and, where there has been conflict, trying to bring reconciliation and restoration in places, that is also sensitive to environmental concerns. So those would be some of my closing thoughts. It's obviously not all about climate. There's so many other things and dynamics going on in the African continent, incredibly complex region, and also a region with incredible resources and capabilities. And so, the hope is that by a more holistic approach, we can address some of these issues that may engender migration in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. Let me move to Laura. Laura, let's hear from you.
My final remark would be, I really believe we have to follow this integrated, holistic approach. And from a Deltares perspective, I think this humanitarian development nexus, I think this is part of the way forward, because it allows us, it gives certain elements that are needed for building this resilience, create opportunities, and not just thinking sometimes of very short-term critical emergency solutions, but more a little bit if possible, more durable solutions that at least then help the people also going to a next level of just covering the basic needs. I think this is an approach that should be followed.
Thank you, Laura. JP, Jean-Paul.
Thank you, Kanta. Very quickly, for me, I think the main thing that emerges, and this is across different areas of intervention, whether it be through the climate conventions or through humanitarian relief, is how you get resources more quickly to the people who need it the most. Because we've seen in COVID, almost 20 trillion, if not, actually, I think it's more now, to over 20 trillion US dollars have been mobilized to respond to COVID in less than 2 years. 100 billion per year is, however, seen as difficult, and that's 0.04%. 0.4% of that almost 20 trillion. So, and then the issue as well is then the inequality with which funds are being invested to address the issues of vulnerability in these marginalized populations. And again, if we take an example in the context of COVID, stimulus program in a country like the DRC translated it into only $11 per capita for that population, as compared to over 11,000 per capita on average in the developed world. So I think the issue is that when an emergency happens, we shouldn't be waiting for a famine. We shouldn't be waiting for the next disaster. We should be finding ways that we can quickly channel the funds into resilience building and investments that are linked to livelihoods in these areas that are extremely sensitive, and as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's going to be tough to summarize. I just want to leave a few messages for partners, us included, all of us. And I think what we've heard from the panel is, I think, a little bit of a push and pull, right? On one hand, we say climate isn't everything, but on the other hand, we can see the stark evidence of how climate is pulling the rug under the feet, particularly of the poorest and the most vulnerable. And so I think it's, really looking at the issue, both ways. It is complex, it is holistic, but let's not also ignore the elephant in the room if it is there. But let's unpack it with the best kind of data, evidence, and inclusive approach. Let's hear from the communities. They will tell us. They have their stories and they have their experiences. I think what I'd also like to take away is sometimes it's not just all gloom. I think that the Africa continent, with the kind of institutional arrangements and the evidence that JP has presented, show many glimmers of hope. I was particularly impressed by this $11 per capita stimulus that can make such a difference. It is about some of these policy shifts that we can really push for and, and get some big change going. I know we're all sort of still digesting what came out of Glasgow, but I think one message we are hearing is that, look, we don't want to keep waiting. We need to act. And even as we keep our ball on the eye on the next COP or the next big event, what we don't want to happen is the next disaster under our watch. And what is it that we can do to avert that? Bringing the best of the analytics, the response from communities, working together in partnership, as was highlighted by Andrew and others, and the data part of it from Alex and Laura. So I'd like to sort of turn back to the ACMI, who I think have taken on this tall order of a very important process. And we are all happily working together with you. And what we want to see is obviously making a difference to those who matter the most and as quickly as we can. So thank you all very much, I think, for a very useful and vibrant discussion on issues that will continue, I think, to occupy us, but for the right reasons. So I'm happy to stay engaged, as I know all of us are. So back to you, Sarah, and I know we're 5 minutes over, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Kanta, and thank you to all the speakers. This was a wonderful panel. I would like to pass the floor to our final speaker of the day, Mrs. Sise Mariama Mohammed, who is the Director for Health, Humanitarian Affairs and Social Development at the African Union Commission. Madam Director, thank you for being with us. Thank you for your leadership in the elaboration and in the implementation of the ACMI. And I pass the floor to you for some final remarks.
Thank you, Sarah. Ladies and gentlemen, dear principal and expert, thank you for the rich discussion today and for lending your support to the African Climate Mobility Initiative. It is heartening to see this level of motivation of the first day of work toward COP27. Your collective willingness to keep focused on the progress we need and to put your proverbial shoulders to the wheel is what keeps us moving forward. Africans have done little to cause the climate crisis, yet we are increasingly exposed to its destructive impact. Tropical storm, flood, and drought in different parts of the continent has displaced tens of thousands of people this year along IDP and refugees who fled violence and conflict are often particularly vulnerable to the impact of disaster are the rural urban migrant who land in hazardous, prone, informed settlement. Climate impacts are often localized, with some area and community being harder hit than others. At the same time, the climate crisis knows no border, beckoning us to think and act on a continental scale while valuing specific local needs. In response, we need an approach that is both bottom-up and top-down. Our responses to the climate crisis should be grounded in local realities and supportive of learning and cooperation among similarly affected communities. Simultaneously, we have an opportunity to strengthen our collective resilience by advancing Africa's ambition for further continental and regional integration. As climate stress on our people and economies intensify, we need to come together to develop and protect our human, natural, and cultural resources. From the African Union Commission, we aim to support our member states with the best available evidence to meet this challenge. We pressed forward the African Climate Mobility Initiative to create the evidence base for developing an African narrative and a common agenda for action on climate force mobility. Going forward, we expect the initiative to contribute to build and sustaining capacity for data collection and analysis on the continent, including through the AU-owned Center of Excellence on Migration, the Migration Observatory in Rabat, and the Research Center in Bamako and Khartoum. Our goal is to foster a vibrant network of knowledge production and exchange to inform policy making at all levels and in all parts of the continent. As was mentioned today, the African Union has an array of legal and policy frameworks that are relevant for addressing climate force mobility, and from the Agenda 2063 and African Free Trade Agreement to the AAU Convention on Refugees and the Kampala Convention on IDP to common framework for migration policy, disaster risk reduction, border governance, agriculture, pastoralism, and more. The challenge is integrating this different strand of policy making and associate sources of funding around a common strategy that enable people to adapt in place, move safely, and well integrated. That is what our agenda for action seeks to do, to provide a common blueprint for data-based, people-centered action and well-informed solution across sector and level of governance. Over the coming year, we will work through the ACMI to develop this blueprint and to craft an African narrative for COP 2070. Together, we can make it the COP that puts people and adaptation need of the most vulnerable at the heart of the climate agenda. The ACMI is a unique and a big tent effort. We recognize that beyond changing temperature and the weather pattern, migration and mobility also bring changes to communities and are best addressed through a wall of society effort, as the Global Compact for Migration so aptly states. That is why we designed the initiative to be open to the contribution of a wide range of stakeholders, from researchers and academia to local and national actors, from grassroots organizations and civil society to philanthropy and the private sector, and of course, regional and international organizations. Over the next few months, we will be conducting a series of consultations to jointly analyze and study the outcome of the comprehensive field research and the modeling work that inform the ACMI's effort. We are grateful to the institution and experts that have already pledged their support to this process and invite all of you to join us. I thank our fellow core partners in this effort, the World Bank, IOM, UNDP, and the UNFCCC, as well as Columbia University, Robert Bosch, and other contributors. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Director Mohammed, and thanks also to the Commissioner El Fadil for your support of this initiative. This concludes our event today. I invite you all to follow us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, like us, distribute us, and we like to hear from you if you have questions or comments at acmi@un.org. You can get in touch with us. And as mentioned, we'll be conducting a series of consultations starting in December. So if there's interest to be a part of that, contact us. Thank you so much and have a nice day.
Bye.